So, if you have experienced anything like I have, you have heard the phrase that nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. I am here to tell you that that statement is 100% accurate. Food tastes good and is delicious, and being skinny feels like crap all the time. Those two things are entirely separate, and there is basically no conjunction between the two of them. So I wanted to dig today a little bit into why this phrase sucks so much and why it is so misleading. So the first is that people eat for a lot of different reasons. It's very easy to imagine that we are only eating because it fuels our bodies, enables us to stay alive, but the reality is that food is something that is very tied up in a lot of emotion, a lot of culture, a lot of habit, and that means that people eat for a lot of different reasons, and it can be very hard to separate those reasons from the very strict value of nutrition that we get out of it. Sometimes people eat for practical reasons. Maybe they eat a specific food because it is cheap, even though they don't like the taste of it, or they eat it because that is what is available to them in their neighborhood, versus what would be much harder to acquire by, say, for example, ordering it specially online and having to pay extra money to get it delivered, or something along those lines. Eating is a pretty emotional process for a lot of people, and that's a good thing. People have things like holidays and traditions that are bound up in the kinds of foods that you eat and when. And yes, of course, there are people at the end of the day who are going to eat specifically only for health and fitness purposes, but that's going to be obviously a very small minority of people compared to everybody else in the world. And that is all to say that eating food, we do that in part because it tastes good. We enjoy the taste of certain foods and we don't like the taste of other foods. And every single time we decide what we're going to eat, we do so based on a bit of a judgment call. Like, okay, what do I have available? What is cheap? What is delicious? What is going to fit my current dietary goals? And so on. So what does being skinny feel like? Well, it's really hard to describe because on the one hand, there is, for example, the cultural belief of what being skinny is, and then on the other hand, there's the actual lived reality of being skinny. So the cultural belief, obviously, is that being skinny is going to be amazing, you're going to feel good, you're going to be healthy, you're going to feel like awesome all the time. And yes, while you might, generally feel a little bit better if you are a bit more active, you have a bit more energy and so on, the reality is that being skinny doesn't magically make your life better. It doesn't do that. That's just not how it works. And culturally, you may experience less in terms of fat phobia or fat shaming, or you may not experience negative comments about your weight or your appearance as a result, but that is something that needs to be maybe separated a little bit from the individual experience, just on your own, of being skinny. Now, talking about the bare individual physical experience of being skinny, I want to go ahead and point out that being skinny sucks. It doesn't feel good. The reality is that in order to be skinny, which is to say being a relatively low body fat percentage relative to your height and so on, you're going to have to calorie restrict. That's just not something that happens naturally for most people. Most people do not have the sort of genetic makeup where they're just going to be skinny all the time, no matter what they eat and so on. And especially it is something where maybe you can get away with it a bit more when you are young and you have a really high metabolism, but then maybe you exercise less as you get older. Maybe you just don't have the same amount of muscle mass that you had when you were a kid. And the end result is that things do start to add up over time, and you do start to potentially gain a little bit more weight if you're not watching your diet carefully. But the reality is that when you set out to intentionally calorie restrict in order to get skinnier, in order to lose body fat, that has a lot of negative effects on your body and on your mind. You're going to feel like crap. It's going to affect you negatively psychologically. Your hormones are going to tank. You're going to recover more poorly. You're not going to be as strong. You're going to lose muscle mass and so on. These are all things that happen when you get skinny. And especially if you end up doing this for a long period of time, this can then get to a point in which it can potentially feed into disordered eating patterns, where you might, for example, binge on foods that you normally would not be incredibly obsessed with, but because you've been in a state where you're generally a little bit hungry and have been denying yourself a lot of food for a very long time, you're going to just see something like a cake or a pie and you're just going to eat a ton of it and you're not really going to be able to stop yourself. I generally have a pretty healthy relationship with food, but in my most recent weight cut, I definitely got to that point. I definitely got to the point where I had been in a diet for a long enough period of time that psychologically it really did begin to affect me and my relationship with food. I began to have little binges here and there. I began to do things where I would say, you can't have this kind of food around me in the house or I'm going to want to compulsively eat it. I would have things where I would get more and more hypercritical of my appearance because after all, I was doing this in order to lose weight, in order to get leaner, in order to get into stage-ready shape. And so because that was the main goal, that became a sort of focus. That became a sort of thing that popped into my head every single time I looked in the mirror. And I began to hyper-analyze every single thing that I ate and every single thing that I did. And I began to, again, fall into potentially unhealthy habits and patterns as a result. Now, of course, I am somebody who has a crap ton of experience manipulating these kinds of variables. I am somebody who has been training and working out for over half of my lifespan, over 16 years at this point. And that means that the reality is that even I, who is about as well trained and about as experienced as it is possible to be in this area, I too began to fall into those negative patterns. Now imagine somebody who is approaching it in a much less healthy way. Somebody who has much fewer tools, much less experience available to them. That is a recipe for disaster, and that is going to be a recipe for making you feel like crap. And that existence really does suck. When I finished my cut, I was the leanest and the best looking I have ever been, but I was also just incredibly exhausted and frustrated, and I had a developing bad relationship with food. I did that as a athletic goal with obviously a very temporary intent, so I wasn't trying to turn this into a long-term thing. And even then, it kind of made me miserable to just dip my toes into that pool for a certain period of time. There are certainly positive benefits to getting lean. Again, I enjoyed the way that I looked. I was specifically looking for a stage lean shape. And so my physique looked basically the best that it ever had. And that was something that validated years and years and years of training and practice that had brought me to this point, and that felt like a success. However, it's really not a sustainable approach for most people, and it is something that could potentially do a lot more harm than good to attempt to endlessly chase leanness just for the sake of leanness, or just because of the cultural expectation that you get out of that. This kind of phrase, saying that nothing tastes as good as skinny feels, is largely intended to normalize the idea that being skinny should feel good culturally, and really pushes to overlook the insanely negative feelings that you can get, the insanely negative symptoms that you can get as a result of prolonged calorie restriction. Being lean on its own probably isn't going to make you happy. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard from people who did crash weight loss courses, lost a ton of weight, and then they really didn't feel happy in their new bodies and in the approach that they designed for themselves and ended up falling off and regaining a lot of the weight. I do believe that it is possible for some people to lean out a bit and develop a healthier relationship with their bodies in the process and to find that empowering and to make that something that they enjoy. However, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily aspirational and necessarily shouldn't be the goal for a lot of people. For most people, getting very lean and staying very lean for a long period of time simply is not feasible or doable. You're not going to magically feel happy all the time. You're not going to magically feel better about your body. And instead, I tend to encourage people to focus on building strength, building muscle mass, finding ways that they can move better, more efficiently in their body. Those tend to be the kinds of things that make people happy and are empowering and don't necessarily involve crushing yourself into bits and pieces, trying to stick to prolonged calorie restriction, which can be devastating. You can get obviously a lot of the positive benefits of lifting weights, training, getting stronger, getting healthier, improving your cardiovascular fitness. You can do all of that without having to really think too much about your diet. And so that is generally the approach that I would recommend for most people. Worry about training first and ignore all that bull crap that you hear about how being skinny feels amazing. So that is all for this week's video. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, don't hesitate to comment down below Let me know what you'd like to see in future videos. Like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, all those other lovely things that you do when you like a video, and I will talk to you all next week. Have a good one.